Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can loosen their grip, and curiosity is allowed to wander without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. Tonight's journey will take us into a soft and thoughtful question that almost everyone carries, often without realizing it. A question that shows up late at night, or during long walks, or in the small pauses between ordinary moments. It sounds simple, but it opens into something vast. What if things had gone differently? Not in a dramatic, movie-like way, not with flashing lights or sudden reversals, but quietly, gently. What if a single choice, a word you didn't say, a road you didn't take, a moment you delayed by just a few seconds, unfolded somewhere else, continuing its story without you ever seeing it? Before we settle into that question, I'd like to invite you, only if it feels right, to gently support this space by liking the video and subscribing. And when you feel ready, you're always welcome to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's a small reminder that even as we explore many possible paths, we're all here together in this one quiet moment. Now, you might want to dim the lights, maybe let the room cool slightly. Perhaps there's a fan humming softly, or the distant sound of traffic or rain against a window. If your mind begins to drift, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing here you need to hold on to tightly. This story will keep moving even if you float in and out of it. Tonight, we'll explore the idea of parallel paths, not as a demand to believe anything unusual, but as an invitation to reflect. We'll move slowly, from everyday feelings into gentle science, and back again. And if sleep finds you along the way, that's not a failure of attention, it's simply another path opening. And so, with no rush at all, let's begin. There's a particular kind of question that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't interrupt your day or demand an answer. Instead, it follows you. It walks a few steps behind, keeping pace, waiting for moments when the world grows quiet enough for it to be heard. What if? It often arrives after a decision has already been made, not while you're choosing, but later, when the room is darker, when the day is finished, when there is nothing left to do but replay small moments in your mind. What if I had stayed a little longer? What if I had left sooner? What if I had said yes? What if I had said nothing at all? These thoughts don't always come with regret. Sometimes they come with relief, sometimes with curiosity, and sometimes they carry no strong emotion at all, just a soft wondering, like noticing a side street you didn't turn down and briefly imagining where it might have led. Most of the time, we don't notice how often our minds do this. It feels so natural that it barely registers as a behaviour. But beneath the surface, this habit of imagining nearby versions of our lives is one of the most consistent features of the human mind. It's as if, after every meaningful choice, the mind quietly sketches a few alternate drafts, not to torture us, not even to correct us, but simply because it can. Imagine standing in a doorway after someone has already closed the door behind you. You are clearly inside now. The room you're in is real, tangible, familiar, and yet for just a moment you can still picture the hallway on the other side, the way the light looked there, the sound of footsteps passing by. Nothing about that hallway is accessible anymore, but it hasn't vanished from your awareness. That's often how what if feels. It's not a scream, it's a faint echo. You might notice it when you remember a message you almost sent, or when you think about a job you nearly accepted, or when you replay a conversation not because it went badly, but because it could have gone differently. What's important to notice is this: the mind doesn't imagine these alternatives because it expects to return to them. It imagines them because that is how it understands the world. The human brain is constantly comparing what happened with what almost happened. It learns not just from outcomes, but from near outcomes, from paths brushed against, then left behind. This ability helps us adapt, anticipate, and make sense of cause and effect. It's one of the quiet tools that allowed our ancestors to survive in uncertain environments. But in modern life, where choices are plentiful and consequences are often delayed, this same tool can feel heavier. We live surrounded by options, more than any generation before us. More choices of work, location, relationships, lifestyles, and identities. Each choice closes some doors, even as it opens others. And the mind, doing what it has always done, keeps track, not obsessively, just attentively. That's why what-if thoughts often appear when we are safe enough to rest, when there is no immediate problem to solve, when the day's noise fades. The mind finally has space to wander the nearby paths it didn't take. And wandering is not the same as wanting to go back. Sometimes, imagining an alternative path doesn't mean you wish you had chosen it. Sometimes it simply means you're acknowledging that it existed, that life could have unfolded another way, that things are not inevitable even after they've happened. This quiet awareness can feel unsettling, or comforting, or both at once, because embedded in every what-if is a deeper realization, the understanding that life is not a single straight line, but a series of gentle turns, and that even when we walk forward, parts of us remain aware of the directions we didn't go. Tonight, we're not here to judge those thoughts. We're not here to silence them or turn them into lessons. We're simply here to notice them, to sit with them, to ask without pressure or urgency why they feel so persistent and why they sometimes feel so close. As we continue, we'll slowly widen the lens. We'll look at how science has tried to describe possibility, choice, and divergence, not with equations or rigid conclusions, but with images and stories that mirror how the mind already thinks. But for now, there's no need to go anywhere else. Just notice this. If you've ever wondered about a version of your life that feels almost real, not because you believe it exists, but because it feels emotionally complete, then you're exactly where you need to be. And we can take the next step together, gently, when you're ready. There was a time when most decisions were made for you long before you were aware of them, where you lived, what kind of work you might do, who you would likely marry, even how long you might live. Many of these paths were shaped by geography, tradition, and necessity. The number of doors was limited, and most people simply walked through the one that stood closest. Life was not easier, but it was narrower. Today the landscape feels very different. Now choices stretch out in every direction. Not just the big ones like careers or relationships, but the small, constant ones that quietly fill a day. What to watch, what to read, what to buy, where to go. Who to respond to, who to ignore. Even rest has become a decision, something scheduled, optimized, compared. It's like standing in a vast building made entirely of doors. Some are clearly marked, others are half open, many appear identical at first glance, and as soon as you choose one, the others do not disappear. They remain visible, lingering in your peripheral vision. This is where the modern weight of what if begins to grow, not because we are weaker than those who came before us, but because we are asked to choose far more often, and each choice, no matter how small, carries with it a subtle sense of loss, not dramatic loss, just the quiet awareness that something else was possible. You may notice this feeling most clearly when you are already tired. After a long day, when your energy is low, even simple decisions can feel heavy. Choosing what to eat, deciding whether to reply now or later, picking one option from many that all seem equally acceptable. In these moments, the mind doesn't feel empowered by choice. It feels burdened by it. This is sometimes described as decision fatigue, though you don't need the term to recognize the experience. It feels like standing at a crossroads one too many times until even the act of choosing feels like effort. And when effort runs out, the mind drifts backward. It begins to revisit decisions already made, not because it expects to change them, but because reflection is easier than action. Imagining an alternate path requires no commitment, no follow-through. It's a place the mind can wander without consequence. In this way, what if becomes a resting place. You might think back to a job you didn't take, not because you want to leave your current one, but because that imagined version of life feels simpler, more contained, free from the complexity you're currently navigating. Or you might recall a relationship that ended, not because you wish it was still happening, but because it represents a version of yourself that felt more certain, or more open, or more hopeful at the time. These reflections aren't failures of gratitude. They're signs of a mind trying to orient itself in a crowded landscape. Popular stories often dramatize this feeling. Films and books love to show characters slipping into alternate timelines, where one different choice leads to a completely transformed life. These stories resonate not because we expect them to be real, but because they mirror an internal truth. We already live surrounded by imagined alternatives. Every profile we scroll past, every life we glimpse from a distance, every success story that reaches us without its hidden costs. Each one quietly suggests a path we didn't take, even when that path was never truly available to us in the first place. The mind is very good at filling in gaps. It can take a fragment of information and build an entire imagined world around it. A different city, a different version of you, a different rhythm to your days. These imagined lives feel complete not because they are accurate, but because they are unchallenged. They never have to confront reality. They never have to endure boredom, disappointment, or uncertainty. They remain perfect because they are unfinished. And this is where the modern experience of what if becomes more intense than ever before. Not because our lives are worse, but because our imaginations are constantly fed with images of alternatives. Yet there is something important to remember here. The human mind did not evolve to choose between thousands of equally plausible futures. It evolved to make good enough decisions with limited information, then move forward. When faced with too many open doors, it does what it has always done best. It imagines nearby outcomes. It compares. It rehearses. It wonders. This is not a flaw. It's a survival skill operating in an unfamiliar environment. So when you find yourself replaying choices late at night, or imagining how things might have gone differently, it doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. It often means you made a real one that mattered, one that required you to close some doors in order to walk through another. The quiet discomfort that follows is not regret by default. Sometimes it is simply the mind acknowledging the cost of commitment. As we sit with this idea, it becomes easier to soften toward those thoughts, to see them not as intrusions but as signals, signs that you're navigating a world rich with possibility, even when that richness feels overwhelming. In the moments before sleep, when the day finally loosens its hold, the mind naturally turns to these unfinished imaginings, not to torment you, but to remind you of something fundamental, that life is not a single, rigid script. It is a series of choices made under imperfect conditions, and that awareness, while sometimes tiring, is also deeply human. As we continue, we'll begin to explore how science has tried to describe this branching of possibility. Not as a judgment on which path is best, but as a way of understanding why the sense of almost feels so persistent. For now, there is nothing you need to decide. Just notice how many doors you've already walked through, and how many you've gently left behind. Sometimes the most influential moments in a life don't feel important at all when they happen. They don't arrive with music or warning. They don't ask you to pause and consider their weight. They slip in unnoticed, dressed as routine. A slight delay, a casual agreement, a choice made because it seemed easier than the alternative. And only later, often much later, do they reveal themselves. You might remember one of these moments as a small fork in the day, a morning when you chose a different route to work, an afternoon when you stayed home instead of going out, an evening when you answered a call you almost ignored. At the time, nothing dramatic followed. The day continued. The world did not react. But somewhere along the way, the shape of your life bent just enough to be felt years later. It's tempting to think that meaningful change requires meaningful decisions, that only big, deliberate choices truly matter. But lived experience often tells a quieter story. A missed train introduces you to a stranger you would never have met otherwise. A late arrival changes the tone of a conversation. A brief hesitation prevents an accident. A moment of courage opens a door that remains open for decades. These are not grand gestures. They are small adjustments, slight shifts in timing and direction that ripple outward, touching more than we can see. The mind is particularly sensitive to these moments because they feel accidental. They don't fit neatly into narratives of intention or control. They challenge the idea that we are always steering our lives deliberately. Instead, they suggest something gentler and more unsettling. That life unfolds through a mix of choice and circumstance, intention and timing. And that sometimes the difference between one life and another is measured in seconds. This awareness can feel both humbling and strange. On one hand, it reminds us that we're not fully in charge, that outcomes don't always reflect effort or merit. On the other hand, it highlights how responsive the world is to even the smallest actions. Like a stone dropped into still water, a minor decision can send ripples far beyond the point where it entered. The surface may settle quickly, but the motion continues beneath, spreading outward in widening circles. We don't usually notice these ripples as they move. We feel them later, when they reach places we never expected to be connected. That's often when the what if thoughts return. What if I had arrived earlier? What if I had taken that invitation? What if I'd spoken just a little more honestly? These questions don't arise because the past is unstable. They arise because the present carries traces of paths that almost formed. History offers countless examples of this sensitivity. Major events turning on weather conditions, timing, chance encounters, or misunderstood messages. But what's striking is that we don't need history to recognize the pattern. We live it constantly, in ways too subtle to name at the time. A relationship begins because two people happen to be in the same place on the same day. A career shifts because of a conversation that was never planned. A life changes direction because someone decided, almost casually, to try something new. From the inside, these moments feel ordinary. From the outside, they look decisive. The mind holds both perspectives at once. It remembers how small the choice felt and how large the consequence became. That contrast gives these memories their peculiar weight. They feel fragile, as though the entire structure of a life rests on something so slight it could have gone the other way with ease. This is why we sometimes replay these moments more than others. Not because they are mistakes, but because they reveal how open the world truly was and still is. Even now, the present moment often feels solid, fixed, settled, but it too is balanced on countless small choices, many of which you won't recognize as significant until they are far behind you. This realization can be unsettling if you approach it with urgency. It can feel like pressure, like every decision must be perfect, every moment carefully managed. but it doesn't have to be felt that way. Another way to see it is this. If small choices can shape lives so profoundly, then life itself is more flexible than it appears, more forgiving, less brittle. It does not require constant precision to unfold meaningfully. It responds to presence more than perfection. The quiet truth is that no one can track all the ripples they create. No one can predict where a small decision will lead, and yet lives continue to form, adapt, and find coherence anyway. This is not chaos. It's responsiveness. The mind, sensing this, returns again and again to those subtle turning points, not to judge them, but to acknowledge their power, to recognize that meaning doesn't only come from grand plans, but from the accumulation of ordinary moments treated with enough attention. As we move forward, we'll begin to explore how science has tried to describe this branching of outcomes, not as fate or randomness alone, but as a natural feature of systems that are sensitive, interconnected, and constantly in motion. For now, let yourself rest with this idea, that your life has been shaped not only by the choices you remember making, but by many you barely noticed at all, and that this does not make your path fragile or accidental. It makes it alive. There is a quiet assumption most of us carry without ever noticing it. The assumption that, at every turning point, the world selects one outcome and discards the rest. You choose one option, and the others simply fade away. They dissolve into imagination, into fiction, into something that never truly existed. The path you walk becomes real. The paths you didn't take become stories. This way of thinking feels natural because it matches our experience. We wake up in one morning, not many. We live one day at a time, not several. Our memories form a single thread, not a bundle. And yet, when scientists began looking closely at the smallest building blocks of reality, they encountered something unexpected. At very small scales, the universe does not behave like a decisive judge. It behaves more like a patient listener. Instead of choosing one outcome immediately, it allows many possibilities to exist side by side, at least for a while. These possibilities do not compete. They do not rush to replace one another. They simply coexist, overlapping like faint melodies played at the same time. To understand this without formulas or symbols, it helps to imagine a moment of indecision frozen in time. Picture yourself standing at a quiet intersection early in the morning. No cars yet, no urgency. You can see several roads branching away from where you stand. For a brief moment, all of them feel equally available. None has claimed you yet. In everyday life, that moment passes quickly. You choose a direction, and your body commits. The other roads fall behind you, but at the smallest scales of nature, that moment seems to linger. Instead of collapsing into a single direction right away, reality allows those different roads to continue forward in parallel, not interacting, not arguing, simply unfolding. This idea is sometimes described as a universe that does not rush to choose. Rather than selecting one outcome and erasing the rest, it allows each possibility to follow its own quiet course. To make this feel less abstract, imagine dropping a pebble into a wide, slow-moving river. At first, the water around the pebble ripples in many directions. No single ripple dominates immediately. They spread outward together, overlapping, blending, fading gradually rather than snapping into place. Now imagine that instead of fading, each ripple continues downstream along its own gentle current. They don't crash into one another. They don't merge back together. They simply drift apart, each following the shape of the river in its own way. In this picture, your experience is like floating on just one of those currents. You feel the motion beneath you. You see the banks passing by. Your journey feels singular and continuous. But that doesn't require the other currents to have vanished. It only means you're no longer travelling alongside them. This way of imagining reality doesn't say that every possibility is equally important or equally noticeable. It simply says that possibility itself is not fragile. It doesn't shatter the moment a decision is made. Instead, it continues quietly, out of reach. One of the reasons this idea feels unsettling is that it challenges a deeply comforting belief. The belief that the past is cleanly resolved, that unchosen outcomes are gone for good, that the world simplifies itself for us. In this view, the world does simplify for our experience, but not necessarily for itself. Your awareness follows one thread, your memory records one sequence. Your life unfolds along one path. But beneath that simplicity, the underlying fabric may be more generous, allowing many threads to exist without demanding that only one be real. This is not a claim that we can visit other paths, or communicate with them, or feel their presence directly. In fact, the most important feature of this picture is how completely separate these paths become. They don't whisper, they don't send signals, they don't interfere, they simply go on. And that silence is essential. If these parallel unfoldings could influence one another, the world would feel chaotic, unstable, inconsistent, but it doesn't. It feels reliable, predictable enough to build lives within, solid enough to trust. The idea here is not that reality is noisy with alternatives, but that it is quiet because those alternatives no longer overlap. Think of it like voices in a large open field. At first, when people stand close together, you can hear many conversations at once. The sounds blend, they overlap. But as people walk away from one another, each voice becomes isolated. Eventually, all you hear is the one nearest to you. The other conversations haven't stopped. They're simply too far away to reach you. In the same way, the path you experience is the one that remains close to you. The others drift out of range, not erased but inaccessible. This framing allows us to think about possibility without urgency. Without the pressure to believe that every decision annihilates countless futures. Instead, it suggests that decisions are more like commitments to one direction of travel. You don't destroy the other roads by choosing one. You simply stop walking beside them. As we continue, we'll look more closely at why these paths become so completely separated. Why they don't blur back together. Why your experience feels so singular and stable, even if the underlying picture is far more expansive. For now, it's enough to hold this gently. The idea that reality may be less decisive than we are, and that beneath the calm surface of your everyday experience, possibility may continue unfolding, quietly and without drama, far beyond what you can see. If many possibilities can unfold at once, a natural question quietly forms. Why don't we notice them? Why does life feel so steady, so consistent, so firmly committed to a single storyline, even when the idea of branching possibilities seems so close at hand? The answer is not found in sudden decisions or dramatic moments. It lies in something far more subtle, a gradual drifting apart, a soft fading of overlap. To picture this, imagine two people walking side by side at dusk. At first, their footsteps match, their shadows stretch together across the ground, their voices are easy to hear, they are part of the same moment. Then one person slows slightly. Not enough to notice at first, just enough to create distance. Over time, the gap grows, their voices become faint, their shadows no longer touch. Eventually, even though both continue walking, each person feels alone on their path. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument, no sudden separation. Just distance accumulating quietly, step by step. This is a helpful way to imagine how different possibilities become isolated from one another. At the smallest levels of nature, possibilities can begin close together, overlapping in a way that allows them to influence the same situation. But the moment those possibilities interact with a wider environment, they start to drift apart. Not violently, not abruptly, simply by becoming entangled with different details of the world around them. Think about how a scent spreads through a room. At first it is concentrated, easy to trace, but as it mixes with air currents, furniture, fabric, and movement, it disperses. Soon, there is no clear boundary where the scent began. It has blended too thoroughly with its surroundings to be gathered back together. In a similar way, when a possible outcome becomes connected with countless tiny details of the environment, it loses the ability to overlap with its alternatives. Light reflects differently. Air molecules move along slightly altered paths. The positions of countless particles shift in response. Each possibility leaves its own faint imprint on the world. Once those imprints differ enough, the paths can no longer interfere with one another. They become separate stories, written into different versions of the same unfolding world. From your perspective, this process feels instantaneous. One moment, you're unsure. The next, something has happened. A result has appeared. A decision seems complete. But beneath that appearance is a gradual settling, a smoothing out of uncertainty, a quiet sorting of possibilities into paths that no longer touch. This is why your experience feels so reliable, not because the universe aggressively eliminates alternatives, but because once your path becomes woven into the broader fabric of the world, it is no longer capable of blending with others. Imagine writing on a fogged mirror. At first, the letters are soft, smudged. They could be altered easily. But as the fog clears and the glass cools, the writing becomes fixed. The mirror no longer accepts new marks in the same way. The moment didn't snap into place. It settled. This settling is what gives the world its sense of solidity, why memories don't rearrange themselves, why objects don't flicker between states, why cause and effect feel dependable enough to trust. And importantly, this settling does not require awareness. You do not have to notice it. You do not have to observe it. You do not have to decide anything for it to happen. The world is already participating, every sound that echoes, every surface that reflects light. Every interaction, no matter how small, contributes to the quiet separation of paths. This is why there is no sense of interference from other possibilities in your daily life. No flickers of alternate outcomes, no bleed-through of other choices, no confusion about which version of events you're experiencing. The separation is too thorough, too complete, and yet the idea of those other paths still feels close. That closeness does not come from physics. It comes from memory and imagination. The mind remembers moments before separation was complete, moments when more than one outcome felt possible. It can revisit those moments because they were once shared spaces of uncertainty. But revisiting them does not reopen them. It simply allows the mind to explore the shape of possibility without disturbing the present. This distinction matters, especially when we think about what-if thoughts late at night. Imagining an alternative does not weaken the reality you're in. It doesn't threaten it. It doesn't undo it. The path you're on is already woven deeply into the world around you. Other paths, if they exist, are equally woven into their own environments, far beyond reach. They are not waiting. They are not listening. They are not watching. They are simply unfolding quietly and independently. Understanding this can bring a sense of calm. It means that wondering does not endanger stability. Reflection does not cause confusion. Curiosity does not fracture reality. You're free to imagine without consequence. As we continue, we'll begin to explore why, Even with such complete separation, the idea of other paths can still feel emotionally present. Why silence itself can carry weight, and why the mind sometimes senses absence as something almost tangible. For now, rest in this thought. The world you experience feels singular because it is for you. Not because other possibilities were destroyed, but because they have drifted too far away to ever overlap again. There is a familiar feeling that arrives the moment something becomes clear. A decision is made, an answer appears, an event resolves itself, and with that resolution comes a sense of finality, as though uncertainty has been cut away cleanly, leaving behind a single, solid result. It feels sudden, immediate, almost sharp. We often describe this feeling using words that suggest abruptness. We say things clicked, or collapsed, or locked into place. The language itself implies that something once wide and open has been narrowed all at once. But when we slow down and look more carefully, this sharpness turns out to be an illusion created by perspective. From the inside, certainty feels instantaneous. From the outside, it is the result of a gradual process that has already finished by the time we notice it. To see this more clearly, imagine watching snow fall onto a quiet field. At first, each flake drifts slowly, uncertain where it will land. The air is full of motion, small variations, countless possible resting places. But as the snow continues to fall, the ground begins to change. Paths disappear. Edges soften. The surface becomes smooth. Eventually, when you look at the field, it feels settled, fixed, covered evenly. The moment of certainty, the moment when the field appears complete, is not the moment when the snow suddenly chose where to land. That choice was made gradually, flake by flake, interaction by interaction, long before the field looked finished. The same is true for outcomes in the world. What feels like a sudden result is often the end of a long, quiet settling. Countless tiny interactions have already shaped the direction. By the time the result becomes visible to you, the uncertainty has already been smoothed away. This is why outcomes feel so clean when they arrive. The complexity has already done its work. Consider the simple act of tossing a coin. From your perspective, the coin spins briefly, then lands. Heads or tails, a clear answer. It feels like the decision happens at the moment the coin touches the ground. But in reality, the outcome was shaped earlier, by the angle of your hand, the force of the toss, the movement of the air, the surface it would land on. Each factor nudged the coin's motion long before it came to rest. By the time you see the result, the uncertainty has already been resolved in countless subtle ways. What you experience as a sudden answer is really a delayed awareness of a process that has finished unfolding. When we apply this understanding to larger questions about reality, the idea of sudden collapse begins to soften. Instead of imagining that the world violently discards alternatives the instant something happens, we can imagine a quieter process. One where possibilities gradually lose their ability to overlap as they become entangled with different details of the environment. By the time you notice a result, the separation has already occurred. Your experience does not cause this settling, it simply arrives after it. This distinction matters because it removes a subtle burden we often place on ourselves. The burden of thinking that our attention, or our awareness, is somehow responsible for forcing outcomes into being. In this gentler picture, awareness is not a trigger, it is a witness. The world does not wait for you to look at it before deciding how to behave. It is already in motion, already interacting, already shaping itself continuously. You step into a moment that has already found its footing. This helps explain why certainty feels so complete when it arrives. Why there is no lingering blur, why you don't experience half results or overlapping outcomes in everyday life. The settling has already finished its work before the moment reaches your awareness, and yet, the memory of uncertainty remains. You remember what it felt like not to know, to stand in that open space where multiple futures seemed possible. That memory gives rise to the impression that something dramatic happened when the outcome appeared. But nothing dramatic was required, only time, interaction, and distance. This understanding allows us to think about outcomes without tension. Instead of seeing life as a series of abrupt closures, we can see it as a continuous flow that gradually narrows into experience, each moment shaped by countless influences, most of which never enter awareness. Certainty, in this view, is not an act of elimination. It is an arrival, a gentle one. And because it is gentle, it does not need to be feared. It does not demand vigilance. It does not require you to watch every moment closely, worried that your attention might somehow force the wrong result. The world is already capable of finding its way. As we move forward, this perspective will help us explore a deeper question. If outcomes settle so quietly and alternatives drift away without drama, why do some unchosen paths still feel emotionally present? Why does the mind sometimes sense absence more strongly than presence? Why does silence carry weight? For now, let this idea rest with you. That certainty does not fall into place, it eases into it. And that the calm stability of your experience is not a sign of rigidity, but of a process that has already finished unfolding by the time you arrive. By now, the idea of many possible paths may feel close, intimate, almost personal. These paths grew from moments that mattered to you, from choices you remember, from uncertainty you once felt in your own body. They seem to exist just beyond reach, like side streets you could almost turn back to if you wished. But there is another way scientists sometimes speak about many worlds, one that feels very different, less emotional, less immediate, and much farther away. It's important to pause here, not to add complexity, but to release it. Because not all ideas of many worlds are about choice. Some are about distance. Imagine standing on a beach at night. Near you, the sand is cool and familiar. You can feel it beneath your feet. A few steps away, the shoreline curves gently, disappearing into darkness. Farther still, beyond what you can see, the coast continues for miles. Beaches you will never walk on, waves you will never hear. They exist, not because you chose them, but because the coastline is long. In a similar way, some scientific ideas suggest that the universe itself may be vast beyond any practical limit, so large that regions far away could unfold differently simply because they are separated by enormous distances, not by decisions but by space and time. In this picture, other worlds are not born from moments in your life. They are not shaped by your choices or awareness. They are simply elsewhere, very far elsewhere. These distant regions are not like branches growing beside you. They are more like towns on the other side of an ocean. Entirely real, perhaps, but completely disconnected from your daily experience. The difference matters, especially for rest. The parallel paths we've been exploring so far feel close because they begin where you are. They emerge from moments you recognize. They share a history with you up to a point, then quietly drift away. The distant worlds imagined in this other view do not share that intimacy. They do not echo your decisions. They do not mirror your life. They do not carry versions of you who chose differently. They are simply part of a vast landscape that extends far beyond what any traveller could reach. Thinking about them can feel abstract, even cold. And that's okay. You don't need to hold both ideas at once. In fact, it's often more restful to separate them. Near possibilities are about closeness, about moments that almost happened, about emotional weight. Distant possibilities are about scale, about size, about how much more exists than we could ever encounter. Both ideas are attempts to describe a universe that is generous with variation, but they operate on very different levels of experience. One lives in memory and imagination. The other lives in maps and measurements. When these ideas are mixed together, confusion can creep in. The listener may begin to feel overwhelmed, as though every choice creates endless consequences across the cosmos, or as though their personal life somehow influences the structure of reality itself. That is not the story we're telling here. The quiet comfort of the parallel paths we've been discussing comes from their intimacy, not their magnitude. They are small, local, close to the texture of your life. They do not multiply responsibility. They do not demand perfection. They simply suggest that possibility is more patient than we often assume. By contrast, the vastness of the universe reminds us of something different. That reality is not centered on us. That many things unfold without reference to our presence at all. And strangely, that can be comforting too. It means you're not carrying the weight of the cosmos on your shoulders. You're not responsible for holding reality together. You're simply one traveller moving through a landscape far larger than any single path. The universe, whether near or distant, does not need constant supervision. It does not require you to choose correctly at every turn. It does not watch anxiously to see what you will do next. It unfolds according to patterns much larger and quieter than any one life. When we understand this, the idea of parallel paths softens. They stop feeling like missed opportunities demanding attention. They become reminders of how open the world once was and how naturally it narrowed into experience. And the distant worlds, those far-off possibilities shaped only by space and time, fade into the background where they belong. Vast, interesting, but not pressing. As we move on, we'll return to what feels closer, to the echoes that remain not because other paths are calling out, but because the human mind remembers standing at the point where they once could have been taken. For now, let distance do its quiet work. Let the far away remain far, and let the path you're on feel small enough to hold, steady enough to rest within, and complete enough to be exactly what it needs to be tonight. There are moments when something feels familiar before it makes sense. A street you're certain you've never walked down before, yet your body relaxes as if it knows the way. A conversation that feels rehearsed, as though you've already lived it once. A sudden emotional response to a situation that doesn't seem to warrant it. These moments rarely arrive with clarity. They don't explain themselves. They don't announce what they mean. They simply appear, linger briefly, and then fade, leaving behind a quiet question. Why did that feel so close? We often reach for dramatic explanations when this happens. We imagine memories from somewhere else, or echoes from a different life, or hints of something unfinished pressing against the present. These interpretations are understandable. The feeling itself is vivid, and vivid experiences invite vivid stories. But there is another way to approach these moments, one that doesn't strip them of meaning, but gently grounds them. The human mind is not a passive recorder of reality. It is an active predictor. Constantly, quietly, it anticipates what might happen next. It builds expectations based on patterns, past experiences, and subtle cues in the environment. Most of the time, this process runs smoothly and invisibly. But sometimes, the prediction and the present moment align just closely enough to feel uncanny. Imagine humming a tune to yourself without realizing it, only to turn on the radio and hear the same melody playing. The coincidence feels striking, even though the explanation is simple. Your mind had already prepared for that pattern. When reality matched it, the overlap felt meaningful. A sense of almost works in much the same way. At many points in life, the mind prepares for multiple possible outcomes. It sketches several futures lightly, without committing fully to any of them. When one of those sketches resembles the present moment closely enough, it can trigger a feeling of recognition, even though nothing has actually repeated. It's not that you've been here before, it's that your mind once imagined being somewhere very similar. These imagined futures don't disappear when a different outcome unfolds. They lose relevance, but they don't vanish completely. They remain as faint impressions like pencil lines beneath a final drawing. Most of the time, you never notice them. But in quiet moments or emotionally charged situations, they can resurface. Not as memories, but as feelings. A sense that something aligns too neatly, or that a moment fits a shape you didn't know you were holding. This is why familiarity often arrives without detail. You don't recall events, you don't see images, you simply feel a soft recognition, detached from any clear source. The mind is recognizing a pattern, not retrieving a memory. This distinction matters. It allows us to appreciate the experience without needing to explain it, as evidence of something extraordinary happening outside of us. The experience is extraordinary enough on its own. It shows how richly layered our inner lives are, how many possibilities the mind considers, even briefly, and how those considerations can leave subtle traces long after a decision has been made. You might notice this feeling most often during transitions. Moving to a new place, starting a new phase of life, standing on the edge of something unknown. In these moments, the mind's predictive activity increases. It sketches more possibilities, preparing for uncertainty. Later, when something unfolds that resembles one of those sketches, the sense of familiarity appears. It's not a message from elsewhere. It's a reminder that your mind once stood at a wider intersection than you realize. This understanding also helps explain why such moments are often emotional. Recognition, even false recognition, creates a feeling of coherence. It tells the mind that the world makes sense, that events fit into patterns, that experience is not random, even when it surprises us, and the mind finds comfort in that. So when you feel that strange familiarity, there is no need to interpret it as a sign that something is calling to you from another path. There is also no need to dismiss it as meaningless. It is a sign of something very human. It means that at some point you imagined a future that looked like this. Not in detail, not deliberately, just enough to leave a contour behind. And now, brushing against that contour, you feel a momentary resonance. As we continue, we'll look at other ways these almosts appear. How absence can feel physical. How unchosen paths can linger like phantom sensations. And why the mind sometimes treats lost possibilities as something that once belonged to us. For now, let this idea rest gently. That familiarity does not require repetition, it only requires proximity, and that the mind, in its quiet preparation for life, often walks alongside paths it never fully takes. There is a curious phenomenon that doctors and patients have described for centuries. After losing a limb, some people continue to feel it. They sense an arm that is no longer there, fingers that itch, a foot that seems to rest on the ground even though it cannot. The body holds on to a map that no longer matches reality, and that map does not fade easily. What's remarkable is not that the sensation exists, but that it feels so real. The mind does not simply erase what is gone, it remembers shapes, positions, expectations, and those memories can persist long after the physical reference point has disappeared. Something similar can happen with unchosen paths, not physically of course, but emotionally. There are lives you almost lived. versions of yourself you nearly became, directions that felt close enough to touch at one point, even if you never fully stepped into them. And sometimes those paths leave behind a sensation that feels oddly solid, despite having no present form. You might feel it when you think about a career you seriously considered, planned for, imagined in detail, and then didn't pursue. Even years later, there may be moments when that version of you feels strangely vivid. Not as regret necessarily, but as presence. Or you might notice it when you encounter someone who resembles a person you once loved, not just in appearance, but in timing, tone, or circumstance. The emotional response arrives quickly, before logic has time to intervene. These experiences don't mean you are stuck in the past. They mean your mind once invested in a future that never fully materialized. Investment leaves traces. When you seriously imagine a future, your mind doesn't treat it as fiction. It begins to prepare for it. It adjusts expectations. It builds emotional scaffolding. It rehearses conversations, routines, identities. If that future is later abandoned, the preparation doesn't vanish instantly. It remains, partially formed, like an unused room in a house that still exists in memory. Most of the time, this causes no trouble at all. The mind quietly repurposes its energy. New futures take shape. Attention shifts, but occasionally, the unused structures are brushed against. A song reminds you of a time when everything felt open. A smell returns you to a moment when several paths were equally possible. A sudden urge appears, pulling you towards something you can't quite name. These are not messages from another life. They're reminders of how deeply the mind once prepared for change. The phantom sensation is not the path itself. It is the imprint of readiness. This perspective helps explain why these feelings often emerge during moments of stress or transition. When life becomes uncertain again, the mind naturally revisits old preparations. It checks its archives. It scans earlier maps of possibility. Not because it wants to go back, but because it's looking for familiar shapes to guide the next step. In these moments, the mind may briefly confuse preparedness with loss. It may feel as though something was taken away, when in fact it was simply never fully used. Understanding this distinction can be quietly liberating. It means that feeling the presence of an unchosen path does not imply that something is missing from your life now. It suggests that at one point, your life was open enough to allow many shapes to form. That openness is not a flaw. It is a sign of flexibility. Some people worry that lingering feelings about alternate lives mean they are failing to move on, that they are stuck, or indecisive, or dissatisfied. But often the opposite is true. These feelings arise precisely because the mind once had the freedom to imagine deeply, because it took possibilities seriously, because it was willing to prepare for change. That capacity does not disappear just because one path was chosen. It remains as part of who you are, and like the sensation of a phantom limb, it doesn't demand action. It doesn't require correction. It simply asks to be noticed without panic. You can acknowledge it without feeding it, feel it without following it. There is no need to chase the sensation, trying to resolve it or make it go away. Doing so only strengthens the impression that something is incomplete. Instead, you can recognize it for what it is, a trace of readiness, a memory of openness, evidence that your life once stood at a wider crossroads than it does now. And that is not something to grieve. As we continue, we'll explore how the mind sometimes interprets these lingering sensations as signs or coincidences, how it weaves stories to explain them, and how those stories can be comforting without needing to be literal. For now, rest with this understanding that not everything you feel needs to be fulfilled, and not every presence points to a missing piece. Some are simply echoes of who you were ready to become. There are moments when life seems to arrange itself just a little too neatly. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and later that day their name appears unexpectedly. You consider a difficult decision, and a stranger's casual comment feels oddly relevant. Two unrelated events line up so perfectly that it feels impossible to ignore. In those moments, the mind leans forward. It asks quietly, "Is this something?" Coincidences have a particular power over us because they sit at the intersection of chance and meaning. They are ordinary events, but their timing feels deliberate. They do not explain themselves, yet they seem to invite interpretation. And when the idea of parallel paths is already close to the surface, coincidence can feel like confirmation, like a sign that something unseen is brushing against the present. But before we travel too far in that direction, it helps to slow down and look gently at what the mind is doing in these moments. The human brain is exceptionally skilled at finding patterns. This skill is older than language, older than writing, older than science itself. It helped our ancestors recognize danger, predict weather, track animals, and survive in uncertain environments. Seeing connections was not optional, it was essential. Because of this, the mind is always scanning the world for relationships between events. It notices timing, it notices repetition, it notices alignment, and when it finds them, it reacts emotionally before it reacts logically. That emotional response is what gives coincidence its weight. Imagine walking through a forest and suddenly seeing a shape that resembles a face in the trees. Your heart might jump for a moment, even if you quickly realize it's just branches and shadows. The response comes first. The explanation follows. Coincidence works the same way. The feeling of meaning arrives before the analysis, and by the time logic steps in, the feeling has already left its imprint. This does not mean coincidences are meaningless. It means their meaning is often internal rather than external. When you're standing at a point of uncertainty in life, the mind becomes especially alert. It searches for guidance, for reassurance, for signs that the path you're on is aligned with something larger than yourself. In these moments, even neutral events can take on significance. A line from a book feels like it was written just for you. A song on the radio seems to answer a question you haven't spoken aloud. These experiences feel personal because your attention is personal. Your questions shape what you notice. This doesn't require the universe to send messages. It only requires a mind that is actively looking. What's interesting is that coincidences tend to cluster around periods of change. New beginnings, endings, decisions that matter, times when your inner map is being redrawn. During these periods, the mind is already holding many possibilities at once. It is more sensitive to alignment, more responsive to overlap, more likely to experience resonance. In other words, coincidence often appears where uncertainty already lives. This perspective allows us to appreciate the experience without needing to explain it as evidence of influence from elsewhere. It preserves the emotional richness without adding pressure to interpret or act. You can allow a coincidence to feel meaningful without insisting that it means something specific. This is important, especially when considering ideas like parallel paths. If we treat every coincidence as a signal from another reality, life becomes noisy, heavy, overloaded with interpretation. Every moment carries the burden of hidden instruction. But if we understand coincidence as a reflection of the mind's sensitivity during times of openness, it becomes lighter, gentler, a moment of alignment rather than a command. It becomes something you can notice, appreciate, and then let pass. There is also comfort in recognizing how common coincidences truly are. In a world filled with countless events, thoughts, and interactions, overlaps are inevitable. When you think of many people over time, eventually one of them will reach out unexpectedly. When you consider many possibilities, some will resemble the present by chance alone. The mind remembers the matches and forgets the misses. This selective memory gives coincidence its glow. But that glow does not need to be extinguished by explanation. It can remain soft and intact. You can think of coincidence as the mind's way of briefly highlighting its own flexibility, its ability to hold multiple threads at once, its talent for weaving narratives even when the threads are loose. In the context of parallel paths, this understanding is grounding. It means that feeling a moment of resonance does not imply that another version of your life is pressing against this one. It suggests that your mind is still capable of sensing possibility, even when your path feels settled. And that capacity is not a problem to solve, it is a resource. As we move forward, we'll explore how these moments of meaning-making can sometimes feel like guidance, even when they arise entirely from within. How intuition forms, how gut feelings emerge, and why they can feel both mysterious and deeply personal. For now, let coincidence be what it is. A moment where attention, timing, and curiosity briefly align. You don't need to decode it. You don't need to follow it. You can simply notice the way it made you pause, and then, gently, continue walking the path you're already on. There are moments when nothing happens, and yet something is felt. No message arrives, no door opens, no clear sign appears, and still there is a sensation, subtle, persistent, difficult to describe, that something is missing, or waiting, or just out of reach. Silence in these moments does not feel empty. It feels charged. We're accustomed to thinking of meaning as something delivered, a word spoken, an event unfolding, a result appearing. But the mind does not only respond to what is present, it also responds to what is absent, especially when that absence follows a moment of possibility. Consider the experience of waiting for a reply. At first, the absence of a response means very little. Minutes pass, then hours. As time stretches on, the silence begins to gather significance, not because it has changed, but because the mind has begun to fill it. Questions arise, interpretations form, emotional weight accumulates. The silence itself has done nothing. And yet, it feels as though it is saying something. This same dynamic often appears around unchosen paths. There are moments in life when several directions felt possible, when outcomes seemed open, when the future had not yet narrowed itself into a single shape. Once that narrowing occurs, the alternatives do not announce their departure. They simply fall quiet, and that quiet can feel louder than action. The mind is especially sensitive to these silent transitions because it remembers the moment before the quiet, the moment when something could have happened, when the space was still open, when the future felt undecided. That memory gives silence its weight. It's not that the unchosen path is communicating, it's that the mind recalls standing at the threshold where communication was possible. This is why silence often feels personal. It seems to respond to your expectations, to your hopes, to the shape of the question you once held. And when no answer arrives, the absence feels intentional, even when it isn't. This tendency has deep roots. The human mind evolved to detect signals in uncertain environments, to notice when something expected failed to appear. A missing sound in the forest could signal danger. A delayed return could indicate trouble. Silence was rarely neutral. That ancient sensitivity remains, even when applied to modern life. So when an opportunity passes without clear resolution, or a potential future fades without explanation, the mind reacts. It treats the absence as information, even when there is none. This doesn't mean the mind is mistaken, it means it is cautious, and in doing so, it sometimes transforms silence into meaning. This can be uncomfortable. Silence invites interpretation but resists clarity. It leaves room for imagination to wander, often towards self-blame or longing. It can turn a neutral outcome into a personal story. What if that path mattered more than I realised? What if something was meant to happen? What if I missed a signal? These questions arise not because there is an answer hidden somewhere, but because the mind prefers uncertainty with explanation to uncertainty without one. Yet silence does not always contain a message. Sometimes it simply marks the boundary between one unfolding and another. In the context of parallel paths, this is an important distinction. If other possibilities exist, they do not announce themselves. They do not leave notes. They do not send reminders. Their silence is not intentional. It is structural. They are not quiet because they have something to say. They're quiet because they are no longer connected. Understanding this can soften the emotional charge of absence. It means that the silence you feel around an unchosen path is not evidence that something is missing from your life now. It is evidence that something once felt close enough to matter, and that closeness, once real, leaves a trace. This trace can feel like a question mark hovering in the background of experience, a sense that something remains unresolved, even when there is nothing left to resolve. But unresolved does not always mean incomplete. Sometimes it simply means that the mind never received a clear signal to stop paying attention. In these moments, it can help to gently remind yourself that not every ending announces itself. Not every possibility gets a conclusion. Some simply fade, leaving behind quiet. And quiet, though unsettling at times, is not harmful. It does not require interpretation. It does not demand a response. It does not imply failure. It is simply the sound of distance increasing. As we continue, we'll begin to look at how the mind interprets these quiet spaces as guidance, how intuition forms in the absence of clear information, and why strong feelings can arise even when no external cause is visible. For now, allow silence to remain what it is, not a message to decode, but a space that once held possibility. And spaces, like paths, do not need to speak in order to have mattered. At some point, the question naturally turns inward. If other paths were possible, and if those paths unfolded quietly away from your awareness, then what became of the person you might have been? This is where the idea of alternate selves often appears. Not as strangers, but as familiar figures standing just outside the frame of your current life. Versions of you shaped by different choices, different timing, different circumstances. The thought can feel unsettling at first. It can sound like competition, like comparison, like a ranking of lives where some version of you did better, chose more wisely, or avoided mistakes you now carry. But this is not the most useful way to hold the idea. A gentler approach is to see these alternate selves not as rivals, but as reflections, like images caught in different windows as you walk down a quiet street at night. Each window shows a version of you shaped by different light, different angles, different rooms behind the glass. None of them cancel the others out, they simply reveal how context shapes experience. Imagine standing at a crossroads earlier in your life. Several directions felt possible. You could sense yourself fitting into more than one future. Each path called to a different set of strengths, interests, and hopes. Choosing one path did not destroy the others. It simply meant that one set of qualities moved forward into daily life, while the others remained potential. Those potentials did not vanish. They folded inward. They became part of your imagination, your empathy, your ability to understand people who chose differently. They enriched your sense of what a life could be. In this way, alternate selves can be seen as teachers rather than ghosts. They remind you that you were once capable of more than one kind of life, that your identity was never narrow or fixed, that you could adapt, learn, and grow in more than one direction. This perspective can be especially comforting during moments of self-doubt. When you feel boxed in by current circumstances, imagining alternate selves can loosen that feeling, not by encouraging escape, but by reminding you that the qualities you admire in those imagined versions are already part of you. They didn't come from another world, they came from you. Perhaps one version of you was more adventurous, more willing to take risks. That version doesn't exist only somewhere else. It exists in the moments when you choose curiosity over comfort. Perhaps another version of you was more grounded, more patient, more focused on stability. That version lives on in the way you care for others, manage responsibility, or build routines that support your well-being. These are not separate people. They are different arrangements of the same elements. Thinking about alternate selves this way removes the pressure to compare outcomes. It shifts attention away from success and failure toward understanding and integration. You don't need to ask which version of you is happiest. Happiness is not a stable destination that one version reaches and another misses. It is a pattern that appears and disappears across time in every life. Every version of you would carry joys and burdens, certainties and doubts, comforts and losses. No path is free of weather. Recognizing this can ease the ache that sometimes accompanies what-if thoughts. It reminds you that the life you didn't live was not perfect. It was simply unknown. And unknown things often appear smoother than real ones because they have not been tested by reality. By bringing imagined selves down from idealization, you allow them to take their proper place as possibilities that helped shape you rather than standards you failed to meet. There is also a quiet ethical dimension to this idea. If you imagine that alternate versions of you are living out different paths, it becomes harder to judge others harshly. You begin to see how much of life depends on circumstance, timing, and chance. You recognize that a small shift could have placed you in a very different position, with different beliefs, different habits, different struggles. The awareness can soften judgment, both toward yourself and toward others. It can increase patience, curiosity, compassion. And importantly, it does not require belief in literal parallel worlds to be effective. Even if alternate selves exist only as mental constructions, they serve a valuable purpose. They expand your sense of identity. They loosen rigid narratives. They remind you that you're not reducible to a single storyline. You're the result of many possibilities, even those that never fully unfolded. As we continue, we'll move deeper into questions of identity. What truly defines you across change? Whether there is a core self that persists regardless of path, and how holding multiple versions of yourself in mind can become a source of stability rather than confusion. For now, let this idea rest gently, that somewhere in your imagination there are many versions of you, not to compete with the one you are, but to quietly remind you of the breadth of who you've always been capable of becoming. Once we begin imagining other versions of ourselves, another question quietly follows. If those versions exist in imagination or elsewhere, are they truly you? Not copies, not characters, but you in some essential way. This question can feel abstract at first, but it touches something deeply personal, because each of us carries an unspoken assumption about what makes us who we are. Is it memory, personality, values, the body we inhabit, the story we tell ourselves about our life? When you change, do you remain the same person? You already know from experience that identity is not fixed. You are not the same person 5 years ago that you are now. Your priorities shifted, your understanding deepened, certain fears faded while others appeared, And yet, despite all of this change, there is a strong sense of continuity. You still feel like yourself. This continuity does not come from sameness. It comes from connection. Imagine reading a long novel over many nights. Each chapter introduces new events, new challenges, new growth. Characters evolve, situations change, but the story remains coherent, not because nothing changes, but because each chapter grows out of the one before it. Your sense of self works much the same way. It is not a single, unchanging core that resists all influence. It is a thread woven through time, connecting moments, experiences and reflections into something that feels whole. When you imagine alternate selves, what changes is not the thread, but the pattern woven around it. Different choices lead to different chapters. Different environments shape different habits. Different relationships draw out different traits. But the capacity to respond, to care, to reflect, remains familiar. This is why imagining alternate selves can feel strangely intimate. You don't picture them as strangers wearing your face. You picture them navigating life with a similar emotional compass, reacting in ways you recognize, struggling with questions that feel close to your own. That recognition does not require a shared memory. It requires shared tendencies, shared sensitivities, shared ways of noticing the world. This suggests a gentler understanding of identity, one that does not depend on a single, indivisible essence, but on a family of traits that persist across change. In this view, identity is not something you either have or lose. It is something that expresses itself differently under different conditions. Just as water can be still or turbulent depending on the riverbed, the same underlying nature can appear calm, ambitious, cautious, or adventurous depending on the circumstances it flows through. This perspective helps resolve a quiet tension. If alternate selves exist, they don't threaten your sense of self. They expand it. They show that who you are is not defined by one outcome, one success, or one mistake. It is defined by a range of responses to life, a pattern of engagement that can take many forms without breaking. There is no need to imagine a single soul stretched thin across multiple realities. No need to divide or duplicate anything sacred. Instead, you can think of identity as something more like a melody. Played on different instruments, the melody sounds different. Faster here, softer there, altered by acoustics, tempo and mood. And yet, you recognize it immediately. It is the same song shaped by different rooms. This analogy also helps with a common fear. The fear that somewhere, another version of you is happier, more successful, more fulfilled, and that by choosing this path you somehow missed out on becoming that person. But happiness is not a static note held indefinitely. It is a rhythm that appears and fades within every life. No version of you escapes uncertainty, loss, or longing. Imagined lives feel smoother because they have not been lived long enough to show their cracks. Reality introduces friction. It introduces responsibility. It introduces complexity. And every path, once fully inhabited, carries those same textures. Understanding this allows imagined selves to settle into a more realistic role. They become perspectives, not destinations. They offer insight into what you value, what you fear, what you hope for. They reveal directions your curiosity once pointed, even if you did not follow them. And those revelations can still inform your life now. You don't need to become an alternate self to learn from one. You can ask gently, what qualities in that imagined version of me feel important? What needs were they trying to meet? What parts of myself was I hoping to express? Often, the answers have less to do with changing your entire life and more to do with small adjustments, more honesty, more creativity, more rest, more connection. These are not radical transformations, they are continuities. As we move forward, we'll begin to explore how this understanding of identity affects how we treat ourselves, how it can soften comparison, reduce regret, and create room for compassion, not just toward who we are now, but toward who we once hoped to be. For now, rest with this thought, that you are not defined by a single path, that the sense of you carry is resilient, adaptable, and capable of unfolding in many ways without losing itself, and that whatever roads you did or did not take, the person listening right now is still fully, unmistakably you. Once alternate versions of yourself enter your imagination, comparison often follows. It happens subtly, almost without intention. You picture a version of yourself who chose differently, and before you realize it, you begin to measure their success against yours, their happiness against your own, their confidence against the doubts you still carry. This comparison rarely feels fair. The imagined version seems smoother, more resolved, less burdened by the complications you now face. Their life appears clearer, as if the right decisions lined up neatly, leading them to a place of ease you somehow missed. But this smoothness is an illusion created by distance. Imagined lives do not include the weight of daily detail. They don't show the arguments that would have happened, the disappointments that would have emerged, or the quiet compromises that would have been required. They skip directly to the outcome, leaving out the effort, the boredom, and the uncertainty that accompany every real life. Reality, by contrast, is textured. It includes waiting, repetition, unfinished tasks, and emotional complexity. It unfolds slowly and often unevenly. When you compare a real life to an imagined one, you are not comparing equals. You're comparing a lived experience to a polished outline. This is why comparison so often leads to discomfort. The mind holds the imagined life as a highlight reel, while your own life is experienced in full length, every pause included, every rough edge visible. Recognizing this difference is the first step towards softening comparison. The second step is noticing when comparison shifts from curiosity into judgment. There is a difference between wondering who you might have been and concluding that who you are is somehow lacking. One invites reflection. The other quietly erodes self-trust. Comparison becomes harmful when it turns imagined selves into ideals rather than perspectives. An ideal is something you feel obligated to reach. A perspective is something you can learn from without pressure. If an alternate version of you appears happier, it's worth asking what happiness represents in that image. Is it freedom, simplicity, recognition, rest? These qualities are not exclusive to any one path. They are experiences that can appear in different forms across many lives. If an imagined self seems more confident, ask what supports that confidence. Was it stability, skill, acceptance? These supports can be cultivated incrementally without rewriting your entire life. Seen this way, alternate selves stop being competitors and become messengers, not messengers from another reality, but from your own values. They show you what matters to you, what you long for, what feels missing or undernourished in your current circumstances, and they do so without demanding that you abandon the life you have. This reframing turns comparison into information. Instead of asking, "Why am I not them?" you can ask, "What are they pointing toward?" Often, the answer is surprisingly gentle. More rest, more creative expression, more connection, more honesty, more space. These are not radical demands, they're invitations. Another important shift happens when you realize that imagined selves are not static. If you return to the same imagined path years later, it will look different. Your values will have changed. Your understanding of happiness will have deepened. What once seemed ideal may now appear incomplete or even unappealing. This fluidity reveals something important. Alternate selves do not exist independently of you. They are shaped by your current perspective. They reflect your present concerns as much as your past choices. This means they cannot be final judges of your life. They are mirrors held at an angle, reflecting what you're currently noticing about yourself. When you understand this, comparison loses its authority. You no longer have to argue with imagined outcomes or defend your choices against them. You can let them speak briefly and then step back. There is also compassion in recognizing that every version of you, imagined or real, would struggle with comparison in their own way. The version who took a different career path might wonder about the stability you have. The version who stayed in a different place might imagine the freedom you gained by leaving. No life escapes this dynamic entirely. Comparison is not a flaw of one path. It is a feature of being human. But it does not have to dominate. You can allow comparison to arise without letting it harden into self-criticism. You can notice the feeling, trace it back to its source, and then gently redirect your attention toward what is within reach now. As we continue, we'll begin to shift from reflection toward acceptance, from understanding alternate selves to learning how to hold your current life with more kindness, how to let imagined paths exist without letting them pull you away from where you are. For now, rest with this thought, that imagined lives feel lighter because they carry no weight, and that the life you are living, with all its texture and complexity, is not a lesser version of anything. It is simply real. There is an unspoken pressure that often hides beneath thoughts of alternate lives, a pressure to believe that somewhere, a better version of you exists, that if you had chosen differently, everything would have aligned more smoothly, that the life you are living now is only one attempt among many, and perhaps not the best one. This pressure is subtle. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It appears in moments of tiredness, in quiet comparisons, in the sense that something important might have been missed. And yet, this pressure rests on a misunderstanding. The idea of many possible lives does not mean that you are meant to live them all. It does not imply that fulfillment requires sampling every path, or that completeness depends on exhausting all options. In fact, the opposite may be true. A life becomes meaningful not by touching every possibility, but by inhabiting one deeply enough for it to take shape. Imagine standing in a vast library, shelves stretch in every direction, filled with books you will never read, stories written in languages you don't speak, volumes that might resonate with you profoundly if you open them, but that will remain closed simply because time is limited. The value of the library does not come from reading every book. It comes from knowing that the books exist and choosing a few to sit with fully. Life works the same way. The presence of many possible paths does not devalue the one you are on. It gives it context. It reminds you that choice is meaningful precisely because it excludes alternatives. If every path could be lived and none would matter, the weight you sometimes feel when thinking about unchosen lives is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of capacity. It shows that you are capable of imagining more than one future, capable of becoming more than one kind of person. That capacity does not disappear because you chose one path. It remains as flexibility, as creativity, as empathy, as the ability to understand lives different from your own. In this way, the idea of parallel paths can be comforting rather than demanding. It allows you to release the idea that you must optimize every decision, that there is a single correct path you must discover and follow perfectly. That one wrong turn would ruin everything. Instead, it suggests something gentler, that many paths can lead to lives worth living, and that the one you are on is not fragile, easily broken by small mistakes. You do not need to get everything right to arrive somewhere meaningful. This perspective also softens regret. Regret often assumes that the unchosen path would have been better in every way, that it would have solved problems without introducing new ones, that it would have provided happiness without cost. But no path offers that. Every life includes difficulty, uncertainty, and loss. Every life asks for trade-offs. The differences lie not in the presence of struggle, but in its form. Understanding this allows regret to loosen its grip. You can acknowledge that another path might have brought different joys without concluding that it would have spared you pain. You can honour what was possible without condemning what is real. And importantly, you can stop measuring your life against a standard that no life could meet. This is where the idea of many possible paths becomes especially gentle. It reminds you that completeness does not come from accumulation. It comes from engagement. You do not need to live every life to understand life. You need only to live one with attention, to notice where you are, to care for what is in front of you, to allow meaning to emerge gradually, rather than chasing it across imagined horizons. This understanding can feel like permission to rest, to stop rehearsing alternatives late into the night, to let imagined lives exist without demanding that they be compared or resolved. Permission to accept that the path you're on is not provisional. It is not a placeholder until something better appears. It is already a life. As we move forward, we'll begin to explore how this acceptance can actively reduce anxiety around choice, how it can transform what if from a source of tension into a quiet source of creativity, and how you can carry this perspective into daily decisions without pressure. For now, let this thought settle. You do not have to live every life to honour possibility. Possibility has already done its work by bringing you here, and that is enough. By this point, the question is no longer whether what-if thoughts will appear. They will. They are part of how the human mind reflects, learns, and imagines. Trying to eliminate them entirely would be like trying to stop the mind from dreaming. The effort itself would only create more tension. The more useful question is quieter and kinder. How can these thoughts be held without letting them cause harm? To answer that, it helps to notice the difference between two kinds of what-if. The first kind is sharp and demanding. It appears with urgency. It insists that a mistake was made, that something must be fixed, that the present moment is somehow insufficient. This version narrows your attention and pulls it backward. The second kind is softer. It feels curious rather than accusatory. It wonders without insisting. It opens space instead of closing it. The difference between these two is not the thought itself, but the posture you take toward it. Imagine holding a fragile object in your hands. If you grip it tightly, afraid of dropping it, you risk breaking it. If you hold it loosely with attention but without strain, it remains intact. What if thoughts are similar? When they are held tightly, they hurt. When they are held gently, they can teach. One way to soften these thoughts is to slow them down. Instead of following them immediately to their imagined conclusion, pause at the beginning. Notice what prompted the thought. Was it fatigue, loneliness, transition, a moment of uncertainty? Often, what-if thoughts appear when a need is present but unnamed. Perhaps the thought is less about the past than it is about something the present is asking for. More rest, more meaning, more connection, more room to breathe. Seen this way, what-if becomes a signal rather than a verdict. Another helpful practice is to separate imagination from evaluation. Imagination explores, evaluation judges. When these two are tangled together, imagination becomes painful. Every imagined alternative turns into a silent accusation against your current life. But when they are separated, imagination regains its freedom. You can imagine a different life without concluding that it would have been better. You can explore an alternative path without treating it as a missed obligation. This shift requires intention, but it does not require force. It can be as simple as changing the tone of your inner voice. Instead of asking, "Why didn't I do that?" you might ask, "What does that version of the story care about?" That question invites reflection without blame. Some people find it helpful to give "what if" thoughts a container, not a prison, but a place. This might take the form of writing, not to plan a new life, but to sketch imagined ones, to explore them as stories, not instructions, to let them exist on the page so they don't have to circle endlessly in the mind. Think of this as a kind of imaginative journaling. You're not trying to solve anything. You're simply allowing the mind to express possibilities that have nowhere else to go. When done gently, this practice can be surprisingly calming. It gives the mind permission to wander without demanding that it act. And often, once the wandering is acknowledged, it quiets on its own. Another key is remembering that imagined futures feel vivid because they are incomplete. They have not yet encountered resistance. They have not yet been tested by reality. Their smoothness is not evidence of superiority. It is a sign that they are still abstract. Real lives, including yours, are textured by friction. They include interruptions, adjustments, and compromise. That texture is not a flaw. It is what makes experience real. Reminding yourself of this can help rebalance the scales. You are not comparing an imperfect life to a perfect one. You are comparing a lived path to an unfinished idea, and unfinished ideas always look lighter. As we move closer to the end of this journey, the role of what if begins to change. It becomes less about alternatives and more about awareness. You might notice that these thoughts often point toward values you care about deeply: creativity, freedom, stability, connection, growth, rest. Rather than asking whether you chose the right path, you can ask how these values might be expressed within the path you're already on. Often, this does not require dramatic change. Small adjustments can honor large values: a few minutes of creative expression, a clearer boundary, a quieter evening, a more honest conversation. These are not new lives. They are refinements of the one you are living, and that is where what if becomes a companion rather than a critic. It stops asking you to abandon your life and starts helping you inhabit it more fully. As we continue, we'll look at how this perspective reshapes decision-making itself, how it reduces fear around choice, and how it allows you to move forward without constantly glancing backward. For now, let this idea settle. You don't need to silence what if. You only need to listen without letting it shout. At some point, all reflections about alternate paths return to a very practical place. The next choice. Not the biggest choice of your life. Not a dramatic turning point. Just the next small decision waiting quietly in front of you. What to do tomorrow. What to say next. Where to place your attention for the next hour. When life is imagined as an infinite landscape of possibilities, decision-making can begin to feel heavy, as though every choice carries enormous weight, as though choosing one thing means permanently turning away from countless others. This sense of pressure does not come from the choice itself. It comes from imagining that you must see the whole landscape before you take a step. But no one ever chooses from the entire landscape. They choose from where they are standing. Imagine walking at night with a lantern. The lantern does not illuminate the entire road. It does not reveal every possible destination. It simply lights the next few steps, enough to move safely, enough to continue. You don't need to know where the road ultimately leads in order to take the next step. And trying to see everything at once would only blind you. In the same way, gentle decision-making begins with accepting limited visibility. You do not need complete information. You do not need to foresee every consequence. You do not need to choose perfectly. You only need to choose honestly from the place you are now. This perspective changes how choices feel in the body. Instead of tightening, there is room to breathe. Instead of urgency, there is steadiness. The decision becomes an act of alignment rather than a test. Alignment does not mean certainty. It means choosing in a way that feels consistent with what you know, what you value, and what you can reasonably carry right now. And what you can carry changes over time. A choice that feels right in one season may feel wrong in another, not because it was mistaken, but because conditions have changed. Energy shifts, priorities evolve, needs rearrange themselves. This does not mean earlier choices were wrong. It means they were right for who you were then. Seeing decisions this way dissolves the idea that there is one correct path waiting to be discovered. Instead, there are many workable paths, each shaped by the way you show up to them. What matters is not selecting the perfect road, but walking the one you choose with attention. When you walk attentively, the path responds. You notice opportunities you would have missed otherwise. You adjust when obstacles appear. You learn what matters to you by watching how you react to what unfolds. This learning does not happen when you remain frozen, waiting for certainty. It happens through movement. Gentle choice-making also means allowing decisions to be small. Not every choice needs to carry the weight of a lifetime. Most decisions shape days, not destinies. They can be revised, redirected, softened. Treating every choice as final creates unnecessary tension. Treating choices as experiments creates room for curiosity. An experiment does not require perfection. It requires observation. You try something, you notice how it feels, you adjust. This approach is especially helpful in a world filled with options. Instead of asking, "Is this the best possible choice?" you can ask, "Is this a reasonable next step?" That question is easier to answer, and it honors the reality that clarity often emerges through action, not before it. There is also comfort in remembering that no choice exists in isolation. You're not choosing once and then living with the result forever. You're choosing again and again in small ways every day. These small choices soften the edges of larger ones. They allow course correction. They create resilience. When you stop demanding that one decision carry everything, the landscape becomes less intimidating. You begin to trust that you can respond to what comes rather than needing to predict it. This trust is not blind optimism. It is grounded in experience. You have already navigated countless choices without full certainty. You have adapted. You have learned. You have found meaning in places you did not plan to be. That history matters. It shows that you do not need to see all possible paths to walk one well. As we near the end of this journey, the idea of many possible lives begins to feel quieter, less like a demand to choose correctly, more like a reassurance that life is not brittle, that small missteps do not ruin everything, that there is room to adjust, to rest, to change pace. The infinite landscape does not require you to explore it all. It only asks that you move with care where you are. For now, let yourself imagine the lantern again. Just a small circle of light, just enough to see the next step, nothing more required, and trust that when you take that step gently, the path will continue to meet you. As our journey begins to slow, everything gently returns to one simple place. Here, not to the infinite landscape of possibility, not to the roads that branched away long ago, not to the lives imagined, sketched, or wondered about in passing, just to this moment. You might notice that after travelling through ideas of many paths, many selves and many possibilities, there is a subtle quiet that remains, a sense that nothing needs to be decided right now. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be chased. That quiet is not emptiness. It is space. Earlier we explored how paths branch, how possibilities drift apart, how imagined lives linger as reflections rather than demands. And slowly, almost without effort, something important has happened. The weight has lifted. The idea of other lives no longer presses against the present. It settles behind you, like scenery fading as a train moves forward. Still there, still real in its own way, but no longer pulling at your attention. This is where the multiverse becomes most gentle. Not as a grand structure of endless realities, but as a reminder that the present moment does not have to carry every unanswered question, that you're not required to resolve the past or anticipate the future in order to be at ease now. Imagine standing at the end of a long walk. Behind you are many intersections, many turns, some taken, some passed by. You can see them in memory, faintly, without needing to return. Ahead of you, the road continues, but it does not demand your gaze. Right now, you're allowed to rest where you're standing. There's a quiet wisdom in recognizing that the present moment is the only place where experience actually happens. Other paths, whether imagined or real, exist as context, not obligation. They show you that life could have been different, and in doing so, they also show you that this life is not accidental. It is one expression among many, shaped by timing, chance, effort, and care. It does not need to be justified by comparison. It does not need to compete with alternatives. It simply needs to be lived. This understanding can feel like coming home, not to a destination you are supposed to reach, but to the awareness that wherever you are now is already part of a complete unfolding. Nothing is missing from this moment that must be supplied by another version of you. Even uncertainty belongs here. Even doubt belongs here. Even the occasional sense of almost belongs here. As a reminder of how open life once felt and how capable you were of imagining many futures. You did not lose those futures. They did their work. They shaped your sensitivity, your empathy, your understanding of choice. And then quietly they stepped aside so one life could continue with clarity. As this exploration comes to a close, there is no lesson to memorize, no conclusion to hold tightly, only a feeling to carry lightly. That your path does not need to be perfect to be meaningful, that your choices do not need to be optimal to be sufficient, that you do not need to live every possible life to honor possibility. You're already doing that by living this one. So if your mind wanders tonight, let it wander kindly. If it drifts toward what if, let the thought pass like a cloud, noticed, but not followed. If it returns to the present, welcome it without expectation. And if rest comes, allow it. Because in this moment, nothing is required of you. Not understanding, not certainty, not resolution, just presence. Just the quiet recognition that this path right now is enough to stand on, and wherever it leads next, it will meet you when you get there,